Hello, everybody. August Kleinzahler has been one of the lodestars of poetry for decades. And for me, since I first started reading his poems in those amazingly titled books, Red Sauce, Whiskey and Snow, Live from the Hong Kong Nile Club, and Green Seas Things and Waves, titles which caused me a kind of cognitive dissonance. You what? I wanted to say, who knew poets could offer up such invitations to think, to immediately bring you along with them into what I'm going to follow Plato by calling the cave of making? Reading August was one thing, skittering riffs followed by landscape studies and crowd scenes and domestic scenes and domestics, all of it done with an interest in character and in the weather and in the hours where life as I knew it took place. And then I saw August reading one afternoon in Dunleary alongside Elaine Ní Cullinan. It was one of those days. Daylight outside, a crowd gathering in the lobby, all of us going into the dark, and hearing August bring those poems together with his inimitable voice and rhythms. Ever since, I've been a fan, someone who looks to August Kleinzahler as a fixed point. I've loved his books, I've loved seeing the poems in the magazines, loved reading the long, trenchant, right-headed reviews he'd write during one of Poetry magazine's good spells. His wonderful essays, autobiographical, pained and poised, and the little book of music reviews, 74 of them, which Pressed Wafer put out in 2009. That was maybe when I started noticing that August's poems were not just musical, but took music and the making of music and what listening does as subjects. Jane Ruth wrote to me, noticing that his Whitney Houston poem is one of those poems that seems to have been translated beyond authorship into some kind of canon of our time. And I suppose reading all of these poems together in the new book, I'm thinking, shouldn't the entire job lot of them, these poems as a history of Western music, be there too? You're going to see and hear what I mean. After all these years, it is a thrill to be publishing August Kleinzahler with Carcanet.
Chapter 63, Whitney Houston. They follow you around the store, these power ballads. You and the women with their shopping carts filled with eggs, cookies, 90 fluid-ounce containers of antibacterial dishwashing liquid, buffeting you sideways like a punishing wind. You stand almost hypnotized at the rosticeria counter, staring at the braised lamb shanks, the patterns those tiny coagulated rivulets of fat make, both knees about to go out from under you. Can I help you, sir? No, thank you. I'm afraid not. It's mostly the one woman who writes these things, a petite, almost perpetually somber brunette in her LA studio, undecorated, two cats, traffic coursing up and down the boulevard outside, curtains drawn against the unrelenting sun. Because of your unconventional lifestyle, you have been shopping among women your entire life. Young mothers and matrons, almost no other males around except staff and seniors, the old men squinching their eyes, scowling at the prices. What sort of life have you led that you find yourself, an adult male of late middle age, about to weep among the avocados and citrus fruits, in a vast, overlit room next to a bosomy Cuban grandma with her sparkly, extravagant eyewear? It's good that your parents are no longer alive. It's a simple formula, really. Verse, verse, chorus, and don't take too long to get there. Verse, chorus, bridge, solo, if any, chorus. Good chance of a key modulation here, really gets them. Electric keyboard, soaring guitar, likely a string part or two. There's no telling how much that woman is worth. A misunderstood Jewish girl from Van Nuys. How would one go about making love to someone like that? Sitting alone in her studio all day, shades drawn, two cats, writing these songs of tortured love, up to the tips of her waders in self-immolation, often keeping at it well into night. Celine Dion, Cher, Michael Bolton, Faith Hill, Toni Braxton, knocking you back one after another, all morning and afternoon, at least until the men arrive after work. I don't know why. Perhaps it has to do with the emotional nature of women. You're breathing all funny, nearly paralyzed. But there's one song they almost never play, and I'll tell you why. It's the one Dolly Parton wrote, not the brunette. But it's not Dolly who's doing the singing. It's the one who just died. Because if they played that one, it wouldn't be just you dying in aisle number 5. All the girls would be dropping, like it was sarin gas pouring from the speakers up there hidden behind the lights. Monk. And this is a very early visit, probably his first visit to Paris in 1954, Thelonious Monk, the great jazz artist. And the French don't know what to make of it. The large black man is dancing. He is dancing in his head on the stage of the Salle Pleyel, and the Parisians are watching as he takes one step to the left. But look, his foot is not touching the ground, as if it's too hot or cold, or not to be found there at all, then slamming it down and spinning round like a drunk in his funny hat. The large black man is dancing on the stage of the Salle Pleyel. He has gotten up from the piano and begun his silly dance, lurching first one way, then, wait, he is changing his mind, frozen there in space, on just one leg. His drummer and bass, Pierre that is, and Claude, puzzling through what he has left behind, soldiering on regardless, wondering where they misplaced the time on the stage of the Salle Pleyel. The large black man is dancing, dancing in his head on the stage of the Salle Pleyel, and hundreds of French are watching him twitch or swat away an imaginary chord in order to make room for the next with a pirouette, courtly as a maitre d' on roller skates. The large black man is dancing, and the Parisians are watching nervously. But the drummer Pierre, that is, and Claude on bass, are beginning to get it. They're watching the black man's dance and think they've found it. Relax, mes chers. We're nearing the end of the tune. The black man is dancing in his head on the stage of the Grand Theatre, and the lovers of jazz are there. They are out there in force, watching the black man from America, watching the black man dance. It is 1954, and the tune is Trinkle Tinkle. What are they to do? What to make of the black man up there dancing? Is he foo? Does he not know where he is or who is in the audience watching? There is the editor of Jazz Hut, Section C, Aisle 12, seat number 2. He will be confused, no? Is he being made the fool? What are they all to do? Pierre and Claude, the drummer that is, and the contrabass, they think, okay, I've got it, where the accents drop, where not, in those very weird spaces between. No, you don't. The large black man in his coat and his tie and the funny little hat and crazy grin. The large black man is dancing. That was the percussive sound. 30 Rue Duluth, which is in Montreal. Elvis is dead, the radio said, where it sat behind a fresh baked loaf of bread and broken link of cold bods, fetched only lately from the boucherie hongroise. Still life without blue pitcher. I read that piece of meat as if I were Chaim Soutine, with its capillaries and tiny kernels of fat bound up in its burnt sienna casing. There and then the motif came to me that would anchor my early masterwork, Opus 113. No? I'll hum a few bars. The window is small and set low on the wall. Little out there to see, only the legs of pedestrians below the knee. Captive, a prisoner nearly, inside the ochre room as the radio poured forth this terrible news. King Elvis is dead. His flesh empurpled, the giant gold medallion, his lolling tongue bitten nearly in two. I took note. The time was propitious for soup, even amidst the bulletins and updates, and then made ready with a preliminary slow-mo casting about that attends the act of creation. A length of sausage readily at hand. Soup making always seemed to settle me back then. Those with whom I lived considered me vain, excepting the Lady M, with whom I tirelessly played Parcheesi, Scrabble, less circumscribed games. She would have bought for me a giant gold medallion, could she have managed the expense. If only I would let her. Presently, the soup was the color of the room, everything around me. The walls, the air, varying shades of ochre, but pebbled with paprika-colored nuggets. They say he existed on tuinol and cheddar. His blood turned to sludge. Odds and ends from this snack and that, buried deep inside him, dating all the way back to blue Hawaii. The fat around his neck like a collar of Boudin Blanc. Every so often he'd soil his white cape, and only, it turns out, in Vegas and while on stage. Now that's what I call a showman. Both afternoon and summer were drawing to a close, while the soup thickened on the stove, the unlit room darkening by degree. The radio resumed its regular programming, and, as always seemed the case that hour of the day, the Gymnopédie by Satie. Chapter 18, Bill Evans. He stared for hours at the cat, taking his ease under the calla leaf, or fog pour in late afternoon, whelming the tower on the hill. How bird, truck, or shout, wind and light, scored day the way the music roll in a Nickelodeon scored, and what it plays in the mind. Along with that afternoon's first set, June 61, the faint tinkle of glasses, muffled conversations, a cough, and he launches into it, LaFaro's bass coming in right behind him, then Motian's simmering brushes. The room, unready, something out of the ordinary about to befall them. Just another leisurely Sunday afternoon, taking refuge from the heat, rising off the sidewalk. My foolish heart. Playing on his stereo now, here in the hate, 30 years later, again and again, through the dying afternoon. The cat, the palm trees swathed in trumpet vine, tufts of cloud floating past the radio tower on the hill, unable to move, overcome, if you will. Fennel, lobelia, shadow and cloud, however many times it takes. Chapter 44. Bebop. Yahtzee, Yahtzee, Yahtzee! At Rapunzel's fungible ball, the most glittery, jittery gala of all, the vedettes and babettes, scarf down, crepe Suzettes, orange butter spray painting the walls. What a feast, what a fete! Scamps vamping away till last call. Yahtzee, Yahtzee, hippity hapsy! Strumbunzella's combustible tatters all, a headache to even recall. So much effervescing, Bozette lost her courgette, her silver barrette, her earrings next, you might say, her bearings wobbling as if ready to. At Rapunzel's jungly, even the discreet left their feet. Rapunzel's fungible varlets at the gate, loath to wait. Tantrums broke plates, a proper Stromboli-strewn brawl. Yahtzee, Yahtzee, sweet do dropsy, quiddities itch, nay timidities twitch, toggle switch bobble, rob Pete to pay gobble, toot sweet, move your feet, try not to fall. Yahtzee, Yahtzee, reek petite tater totsy, a ramped up dance, call it cha-cha fobachi, chakalita, chakalita, chicka chakalita, bonga boonga, binga binga, boonga bonga bonga tonga, strombolita escondido, oh solito, tutti frutti, hamarubi. Peekabuchi, Slofobachi, syncopated commotion, addled emu shunned. Yahtzee, Yahtzee, Yahtzee! Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your, the hottest ticket of all, glittery, jittery Rapunzel's fungible ball. The magic flute, sort of used record store that doesn't exist anymore. But did once. Flynn fell off the cable car and landed on his head. Poor Flynn, hardly Flynn anymore, in a dinghy, listing to starboard. Flynn on his stool, holding court down the block at the magic flute, his hound at his feet, while the old LPs hissed and popped through the weekend. Boccherini and Mississippi Fred, the plucky chanteuse and gag tunes. Flynn with his mug of rum and that faraway gaze, a wryness at the eyes and mouth, frozen into a carapace over some enormous hurt. You see it in the look of old beatniks at their rituals in the cafe and bar windows of North Beach, solemnly playing cards at noon, afflicted with some private wisdom, denied parturition. Flynn, drunken alone in his shop weekday afternoons with his binfuls of concerti and wailing brass, along with his dog and his rum and the fog coming in and too stiff to get up and change the record. And Flynn with his secret poems in a fancy red box, thwarted and feverish and illustrated by a suburban Beardsley. Whatever ache or shame, prettified, made diffuse and tied with a rhyme, like a ribbon around a present. The ghost of him presiding over those last lost afternoons, weeks after the earthquake, laths and studs showing through the walls and plaster, sprinkling the ancient vocalions. Now, a consortium's gone and bought the block, and the old place has a brand new front with black glass, very minimal, very flash, and sells computer software. And Flynn drifts further and further to sea in a bed for old strays at Laguna Honda, a hospital for the impoverished in San Francisco. I believe not now closed. Now they simply turn them to Solient Green. Chapter 57, Route 4. Coltrane just sits there, almost expressionless, thoughtful, perhaps even a touch somber, on the little red stool in my bedroom, listening to the Dodger radio broadcast from Ebbets Field. We speak not at all. Occasionally, he might lift an eyebrow when Vince Scully raises his voice If Duke blasts one out or Gino Simoli guns a runner down going for second. He's a handsome man with a well-shaped head, but a bit puffy around the eyes, like in the cover photo of A Love Supreme. But this is earlier, 57 or so. It's evening, after dinner, the family downstairs doing what they do. John will come by now and then to sit with me on his way back from Van Gelder's studio in Hackensack after recording all day. Or Taylor or Red Garland might drop him off here on their way back into the city. Usually they all just hop on a bus, the 162, to the uptown bus terminal near Columbia Presbyterian. Are you familiar with his composition, Route 4, the highway they travel? It really moves. I never know when John will turn up, but I'm always happy when he does. More than happy. Mom and Dad seem amenable to his visits, even Grand, very out of character, who barks like mad when the doorbell rings. In some ways, John Coltrane has replaced Grand, who would sit watchfully beside me when I was smaller still, my guardian. When John's on hand, it's like Grand's night off, and he flops down under the living room coffee table for an extended nap near my folks, who are reading the Atlantic Monthly or John O'Hara, like that. Can't remember them ever listening to jazz or even knowing who Coltrane is. Just this exceedingly polite and kind young black man who enjoys sitting with Og and keeping him company. Nothing odd about that. I really can't recall exactly when these visits first began, but they remain vivid in my memories of childhood, like snow days playing with my toy soldiers, or the aromas of Hiram's hot dogs frying in deep fat, and remain most comforting. Even today, all these years later, whenever I'm a bit off or in need of something, I don't quite know what, I play his prestige sides from 1957, Russian Lullaby, or Training In, and think of my friend, John Coltrane, just sitting there beside me, listening. Bay Lullaby. Tuesdays are bad for sausage and flowers. Rain sweeping in off the sea, foghorns lowing like outsized beasts, shackled to cliffs at the mouth of the bay. You hear them from under the movie marquee before going in to dry off and plush, alone behind two old ladies, that song of a wanton from long ago, temptation, filling the empty room. Across the city's northwest quadrant, 2, maybe 3 miles in, drifting through holes in the traffic and rain, you hear them warning ships off the rocks, moaning like fettered gods. Lilies begun to curl, and meat gone sad at the delicatessen, trays of worshed, fat seeping into the skins before Thursday delivery and the big weekend. As morning's first trolley clears the track, the cat's petite snores, my love's upper lip beaded with sweat, you can still hear them out there in the dark, mingling their calls in the rain. I think that's a wrap.
Wonderful to hear the poems, August.
My pleasure.
Just fantastic. When I saw you were going to read the Yahtzee Yahtzee poem, I was just thinking, he's not. um, August, I'm going to maybe just ask a couple of background questions for, you'll have a lot of friends in the room, but there'll be some new readers too. And I do wish that we were doing this over a drink in a bar after the reading,
Me too.
rather than in the early afternoon there and the evening here. Um, but could you tell us a little bit about what was the first or the first couple of poems that came to you for this history of music when you were starting to write them?
Well, the first one, as I talked about on one of your social media posts, I was in London I was doing a series of readings in Britain and Dublin, and for some reason the muzak of that fortnight was uh, Mahler's Adagietto from his Symphony Number 5, which
Mm.
many of the listeners might remember from Visconti's Death in Venice. It's really a heartrending, magnificent piece of music. And but it was odd encountering it in Heathrow and uh, pub toilets and train stations and so forth. And at the same time, it happened to be, at least in London, Frank Sinatra Week.
Mm.
So along with the Mahler, everywhere you went were Frank Sinatra hits. I did it my way, so forth. And they had Sinatra movies on TV. Um, Tony Rome with Angie Dickinson as a love interest. They had an ad on TV with a Weimaraner singing "I Did It My Way," um, and it was also quite surreal. And then the juxtaposition of Mahler and Sinatra, these two totally unlike
Yeah.
human beings and musical entities, titillated me.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and at the time, I was writing a weekly column for the San Diego Reader called, well, it wasn't called anything, but right, which collected in that volume of 74 pieces of music. And so I decided to call it, um, because it was high and low in it, and Mahler and Sinatra and Ava Gardner, um, and Alma and whatnot. I started to give it a highfalutin scholarly title called A History of Western Music. And that became chapter 1.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then as I proceeded apace for the next 25 years or so, um, uh, whenever there was a musical component in a poem, and there often was because it's prominent in my life, and the column only lasted for 2 or 3 years, but I, I, I decided a chapter
Yeah.
in a history of Western music, and over this course of time, which is 25 years, uh, the London Review of Books seemed to enjoy it and enjoy the series, and pretty much published every single one. So it got a lovely readership across Britain and the States and elsewhere. So that's how it came to pass. And then after 25 years of doing this and going through my work one day, I realized there were at least a couple of dozen chapters in the history of Western music, a book length number of chapters, and there had been some previous musical poems. The Bill Evans poem is quite early, and the Flynn poem as well. So there's several of those, and that's pretty much the how
Yeah.
we arrived.
Yeah. So our friend Daisy Freed, who's here tonight, I know she called this an ekphrastic book, because you're responding to so many different kinds of music when you're doing it. But we're also reminded always about how it's impossible to write about music. Elvis Costello, this line about us dancing about architecture is although I'd quite like to see that. But so did that give you pause when you were kind of trying to move things? Was that on your mind as you were beginning to write the poems after the newspaper columns? Was there?
Uh, yeah, that's interesting. Daisy knows a lot of fancy words, by the way. The in retrospect, since you asked, I think it's more approachable in poetry for some reason, in its discursiveness, jumping around, and than uh, it is in essay form, because it's notoriously difficult. The effects of music are largely ineffable, so you wind up talking, writing overly much about biography and background and
Hmm.
historical context. And
Yeah.
so I was much less self-conscious and uninhibited in the poetry.
And did you have like I'm thinking especially of that of the bebop poem, I suppose, where there is a real sense that you're kind of you're trying to draw what be I feel you're trying to draw what bebop does, the way that stops and starts and goes again and takes off, and trying to take what music does into poetry.
Yeah, I was trying to give a sense of I mean there are volumes of poems about jazz which are uniformly awful.
Mm.
There's one good poem, um, or remarkable poem, and I think Carcanet published it, by Roy Fisher. It's the title of his book, The
Oh,
Thing About
I
Joe
love it.
Sullivan. Yeah, it's perfect. Um, but uh, but remind me what you just asked again.
Just about writing in the style of different kinds of music, and
Oh,
about trying to catch that and kind of bring it across on the page, which is such a difficult thing to do, but it does feel like you're
I think,
after that.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think bebop. I took that on more directly. Doing some of the things that happen in bebop, um, the diversions and the blending of elements and
Yeah.
uh, the percussiveness and speed and like
Now,
that.
I know I'm going to point out that anybody who wants to ask a question, if you can just put it in the Q&A box. I may have forgotten to say that, but please do. If you have any questions for August, I can see there's a bunch of kind of nice comments, which we'll come to. But if you have any questions, do pop them into the chat as well. Um, the Whitney Houston poem, I do have to ask you about that. I can just remember when it fell open, in the Stranger. I remember going, "Oh my God, where does that poem come from?" And it is a sort of a ballad too, isn't it? Like it does have, and that line about about your parents and things like this coming in. It is a sort of it's a poem with a number of killer lines as it goes along, but it has the regular stanzas and that kind of ballad form, but with sarin gas. Um, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that poem.
Um, I had it framed up um, well before I wrote it. Walking around uh, a particular market in town. I come from New Jersey, Fort Lee, an Italian market, smallish Italian market, and it was odd. Um, the nature of these songs is tortured love ballads, and um, uh, with the Italian American women squeezing tomatoes and uh, instructing the guys behind the counter how thick to slice the capicola and whatnot. And I said, I'd like to do something like this. And then there was another market, a large supermarket, sort of a generic large supermarket, about a mile away where I also shopped, and um, which most of the visual parts of the poem take place there with the Cuban grandma, because there are a lot of Cuban people in that area. And basically, I waited till I uh, had a terrible breakup. I felt uh, tormented, and the way the songs go, and the Whitney Houston. Even reading it now, it's hard for me to even read it without tearing up.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just a spectacular
Mm.
performance and song, and it's in a terrible movie called The Bodyguard. But so as I said, I had it pretty much set up, and I love shopping at grocery stores, at supermarkets, um, and I did a little research on power ballads, and then dove right in.
Fantastic. I've got two questions that I'm going to ask you from other people before I come back in. Actually, three. Um, So the first one, I suppose, is you have so many different kinds of music which you use in the poems. I suppose it's not, they're not often, sometimes it's not responding to them, but it comes in. But Martin Bieber wants to know if you have a view on death metal music. Martin says he's 71 and went to his first death metal gig last week, and he loved it. So,
One of the columns I wrote said something derogatory about I think someone who come under the death metal rubric, and because music is so personal, the paper printed 12 irate letters, one of which said, August Kleinzahler, you can tell by the name he's a Nazi. You know, you
uh,
know, and uh, violent, violent animus, and of course I love that sort of thing.
yeah, yeah. Um, Matthew Welton, and another terrific poet here. Matthew says, "What a brilliant reading!" And he's wondering about the way the sequence of the poems developed, and when did you realize that it was part of your repertoire and your activity of what you're going to be doing? And did that mean that you had things you wanted to fill in? Did it change what you wanted to do with the music poems as you began to look at them together?
The ones I read today, or just generally.
Just generally, like, did you come to a point where you thought, "Oh, I'm onto something," and there's stuff? Did it create a kind of obligation for you for things that you needed to do to other kinds of music, or?
No, I mean they were written already, so I just assembled them, and there was uh, a conscious attempt to um, uh, assemble them the way, uh, say, jazz artist assembles a musical album, up tempo,
Hmm.
ballad, so forth, mix them up a bit, and
Yeah.
so that they didn't bark at each other, step on each other's toes, and begin well and end well, and that sort of stuff.
Royston Tester wants to ask about the endings, which he says are especially powerful, and how do the endings come? And I know exactly what Royston means. There are rhythmic things that happen towards the end of your poems, which I'm always looking at. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Uh, well, sometimes they don't end well, and I know it, and that can be a a huge frustration and problem. And um, when I was younger, there are poems I would put away um, literally for years until I figured out a way to uh, resolve them. Um, Usually, and at this point, they find their way toward an end. And if I'll know if it's unsatisfactory, if it feels unsatisfactory. I might feel it splendidly, but it's in fact unsatisfactory
Yeah,
to many reasons. But
yeah,
uh, often flying by instrument in a rainstorm, um,
yeah, yeah,
hoping to land on the fairway, not on the fairway, um, uh,
the fun way.
on the
Yeah,
runway.
yeah. Um, I guess I suppose that, you're mentioning earlier poems, I suppose, and it's an image that I have from one of your essays about Basil Bunting, um, who you studied with in British Columbia, and who's a poet who, he's come back into prominence and has had, your own work in terms of writing about him has been part of that. But he was a poet of music as well. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, or if that's had anything to do with how you think about poetry and music since.
Oh, very much so. And I cottoned on to him uh, at an impressionable age. I think I was 21, and I encountered a copy, the Fulcrum copy of Brick Flats, just the poem Brick Flats in a paperback at the Willence's 8th Street bookstore in Greenwich Village. And the proverbial hair stood up on the back of my neck. And this was what I'd been looking for. And I remember taking it home and reading it straight through and just exhilarated. And the rhythmic qualities, the concision, the patterning. And I was my existence was quite irregular, unstable at that point. So I stuck out my thumb one day and hitchhiked to go back to college at the University of Victoria, rather randomly. I'd passed through there hitchhiking uh, maybe a year before, and it was very inexpensive. It cost $500 a year. And I got there and I went to the head of the English department and I said, I'm interested in taking a course in contemporary poetry. And he said, well, we have a visiting professor. You won't know his name. Um, he's an old man. His name Basil Bunting. And, my eyes crossed and my head started spinning around like that little girl in The Exorcist. And we were off to the races. And he taught a course in contemporary and modern 20th century poetry. And he also taught a creative writing class, which, he thought was ridiculous. And, it remains a ridiculous enterprise. And and he said, you're not far enough along as poets for me to say anything helpful. So I'm going to read to you. And he read to us, uh, much of it by heart, and often in other languages, because his idea was you could get the sense of the poem, the emotion of the poem, by the sound of it. He was very invested in that aspect of poetry, and eventually alienated almost everybody. So I think there were maybe three of us left. So we'd meet at his bungalow by the ocean, by the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and he'd buy a case of Toby's beer. Do they still have Toby? Britain? No. And he'd be smoking his unfiltered players, and he'd read us poetry aloud. He'd tell stories, some of them quite ribald, and he'd play music for us, especially Baroque music. And he obviously likes Scarlatti because Scarlatti uses Scarlatti as a background to Brick Flats, the Goldberg variations, with which I wasn't familiar, and Purcell and Dowland, and the last maybe 6 weeks of the semester, uh, that's
Yeah.
what we did, and it was the most extraordinary experiences, teaching, way of teaching, and I was just drank it up
Yeah.
like beer on a hot day, and I got a tremendous amount from it. And but he so alienated the English department by doing that, and they were so unpleasant to him, particularly a British poet named Robin Skelton, whom I'm sure is dead. Um, uh, it made his life a misery that he left early, and he went back to uh, Newcastle, but not before I had that marvelous encounter.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a slightly maddening subject matter these days, but that day of crossing the border into Canada and the Canadian relations as they are now, and I know you published, I think, your first book in Canada, or
First three, yeah, two of mine and an anthology of Canadian poets
well,
called Seven Canadian Poets.
yeah, and I'm just wondering how you're finding the current climate outside your window, and how you're surviving it.
Not well. Um, Quite frankly, my wife and I are rather shell-shocked. I there have been bleak periods, political periods in my lifetime, but I never expected fascism to turn up on the doorstep of America in my lifetime. And uh, what does one say? And to watch all the uh, business leaders, the heads of Amazon and Google and uh, the rest just uh, jump ship like rats. You just see how it happens, and it's obvious to me that's how it happened in 1938, and really they're using Goebbels as a template, but they're too stupid and erratic to do it properly. So they're just making a horrific mess and dragging the world down with them. And I just want to, I'm sickened and I am and embarrassed, particularly, speaking to mostly British people. Uh, you don't, you did nothing to deserve this. Um,
Yeah, it's a
What we did, the Americans did. We voted for him, and the majority of Americans are still very excited about the prospect of a strong man, and uh, and the rest of it. And they'll soon find out what life is like under a strong man.
Augusta. I'm going to finish off now. I'm not sure if there are any other questions that anybody has, and if there are, do put them into the Q&A. But I suppose it's another thought. I think I visited you in San Francisco 13 or 14 years ago, and I don't know if you recall this, but as we were walking down the street, groups of young men kept on coming over and shouting, "Yo, Augie," and high-fiving you.
I don't remember that.
And I
It must
thought,
it
I
must have
thought,
been from the bar.
I thought, I thought, I thought, what kind of world? Like, I know he's good, but this is. But
I,
I think you explained to me that it was the week after you had been on the Anthony Bourdain TV show,
oh, right, right,
and
right, right.
you
Yes,
had your
that was
absolute
unsettling.
celebrity status in San Francisco, and I was, very, very taken with this.
The taxi drivers would honk at me and scream out, "Hey, poet!" And
It,
then it went away. No one paid any
uh,
my brief moment of
yeah. Well, for me, that's still the role you have out there, you know. So,
hold on to that.
yeah, 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 yeah. Um, I do have another. I have a question from Evan Jones, and Evan wants to know what is your like the image of Elvis with his boudin blanc. Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal. Evan wants to know what's your favorite period Elvis.
Oh, early hound dog. Uh, Very raw with a band that could only play about three chords and uh, uh, like that, which is which wasn't his song. It's a Big Mama Thornton song. So go to YouTube and check out Big Mama, who's a Big Mama, Thornton singing it, and um, Elvis does a great job, but she does a better job.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, August. Wonderful to see you. Great to hear the poems. Great to have those recommendations. And I know there's actually an online Spotify playlist in which you can actually track the fantastic series of records and different musicians that you talk about in a history of Western music. And I'm going to invite my colleague Jazz back on screen to tell us about what's coming next. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming tonight, and see you, August.
Adios, my friend.